So because I gained sentience on a date before November 14th, 2018, I actually remember a time when dunking on Bethesda Game Studio was not the popular thing to do. In fact, it was deeply unpopular for quite a long time, and for most of my adolescence, I was happy to uphold the status quo. I was a ravenous fan of Bethesda games. Liking Fallout was like 90% of my dumbass personality. Despite 3's numerous issues and truly, unabashedly retarded writing, I loved it dearly. And it's no secret to longtime PBJ viewers that Fallout New Vegas is still my favorite game of all time. And yes, Obsidian are the ones who actually made that game, and that's why it's much better, but I suppose Bethesda still deserves some credit for making it happen. Then you've got the more recent Elder Scrolls titles, which pretty much function as an exploration of the typical furry's sick little power fantasies, with worlds and characters so superficially charming that apparently we'll all just ignore the fact that they have the worst combat of any series ever. But I think I'm losing the plot. Let me veer back. While on the verge of manhood in November of 2015, having lived my young life a particular way with particular beliefs and culture, you can imagine my horror when Fallout 4 releases and it's just fucking lame. It doesn't have a personality, it doesn't have real role-playing, and has a bunch of dumbass features no one asked for instead. Every character is purposefully written to be as sackless as possible. There's very little sense of consequence for anything you do, and the game world lacks any inherent storytelling outside of "big bombs fell." It feels like it was built by AI given the prompt's quirky apocalypse and nothing else. I don't care for Fallout 4, and that sent me into Starfield almost 8 years later with virtually nothing in the way of expectations. And while I don't think it's amazing, I do think it's better than their last couple releases for what that's worth, and in some ways Bethesda's best title to date, making a handful of improvements to their comfortable formula. Anyway, let's try to make this short.
We straight gassing, cutting straight to the bricks. Ha ha!
So I didn't follow the hype and the discourse leading up to this game's release. I have no fucking clue what Mr. Howard promised to give you. If you were expecting that all, or most, or even a handful of the game's planets would boast content-populated regions comparable to entire prior Bethesda open worlds, I would say that's a silly expectation. But that certainly doesn't mean the game world we got is without issue. What you really have is about 2 standard Bethesda maps worth of actual content, which is pretty good, but spread across 1,000 fucking planets that you won't bother to visit. And for a portion of players, the insane sense of scale offered by Starfield is enough to make up for the fact that it's mostly dead zone, while the rest of us call that cope. Quick side note, just for Bethesda, please add ground-based vehicles to the game. I don't know how that oversight even happens. Why am I constantly running for multiple real-life minutes through a pale gray void to reach small compounds and single NPCs? Correct this, please and thank you, and I swear to all that is holy in this fuck-forsaken galaxy, if it's paid DLC, I'll go to Maryland myself. But let's get back on track. With all that said, I quite like Starfield's game world. The major population centers are well made and varied. You've got standard futuristic city environments, slum areas, cyberpunk, the Wild West, space pirate stations, mining colonies, and more. Every location harbors many NPCs to talk with and receive lore and missions from. The many factions of the galaxy operate throughout the regions in sensible ways, and your particular affiliations can affect how you're received by others to a limited extent. Now that's the big picture view. I think Starfield is a genuine achievement in terms of the pure amount of content for a game of this kind, but when you zoom in, this is still a Bethesda product. When it comes to storylines driven by player choice and captivating characters, well, we know that nobody at their HQ is in line for a fucking Pulitzer Prize. What they can nail, and it's been this way for a long time, is the big picture and small, isolated pieces of storytelling, and where they flounder is in the nuance. All of the factions are at least a little interesting, their structure and behaviors make sense on a galactic scale, the key points and progression of the main questline can genuinely pique interest at isolated moments, but how it's all represented through characters can leave a lot to be desired. Dialogue often feels stunted and inorganic, choices constantly boil down and result in uncreative outcomes, because the world just isn't capable of being truly reactive to the player outside of major faction affiliations, and even that's only a fraction of the time. You're not really changing the world through choices, you're filling a predetermined slot while flavor text forms around you. On top of that, and we're going to get just a tiny bit abstract now, there are no big questions being asked, and no major figures to ask them. There's no Caesar, no House, no Master, there's not even a Frank Horrigan. These two fucking mouth breathers, they're not fit to shimmy down Frankie's knob. Let me expand on what I mean, and we'll use the Master as an example because I think he falls under the easiest archetype for skilled RPG writers to emulate. He is unequivocally wrong in his quest to enslave humanity and turn them into his personal little peaceful mutant play race. I think that goes without saying, even before the major gaps in his plan are revealed. But he forces a good, simple point. All humanity has ultimately managed to do with their boundless intelligence and potential is destroy the world and themselves for petty reasons. You spend all of Fallout 1 wallowing in this new hell, while most of the people left over prove that they've learned nothing in the face of Armageddon. You know that the Master is wrong, and that human individuality is worth preserving despite the suffering it inherently brings, but you have to find the reasons why, while bombarded with evidence to the contrary. And this is not genius storytelling by any stretch. Thousands of games, movies, novels, etc. operate at an equal or higher level of philosophical complexity, but Starfield simply doesn't. Starfield's story similarly centers around the inherent destructiveness of humanity. They even manage to destroy Earth in this game too, and that's not even really seen as a big deal. It delves into the multiverse, and through some of its missions and locations, makes the whole thing a lot more interesting than other pieces of media have managed to its credit. But I'll get to the meat and potatoes. Multiversal travel has enabled a small group of highly motivated individuals, now including yourself, to traverse countless parallel universes. And they've decided to use this unimaginable gift and essentially immortality to collect alien MacGuffins and keep racing through new dimensions while sowing destruction in their wake and going out of their way to make sure they never help anybody. An interesting concept, and in theory, this should mean the stakes have never been higher for any player character ever. But they just fucking forgot to write in a moral conflict. Here's the ending dilemma, spoiler alert. One faction of MacGuffin collectors believes that everyone should be allowed to hunt MacGuffins and that the strongest should prevail, while the other faction believes that there should be a tribunal in place to make sure that only the people they arbitrarily deem fit are allowed to hunt MacGuffins. Thank God you can tell both of them to piss off at least, but you see my problem, right? You're not even asking me a real question. I didn't think it was possible to miss the forest for the trees this hard. You're missing the forest for the fucking gravel next to the road. Being charitable, I guess you could say you're deciding whether you champion free will in the most autistic way possible, but that is very charitable. Like, what happened in that writing room? But anyway, this is only something that would really get me worked up if I was expecting a deep RPG experience with nuanced writing. And I wasn't. I was expecting a fun romp through space, and in that regard I still think Starfield delivers. It's shallow, but a lot of the characters are fun, your followers have distinct personalities and worldviews, and usually aren't cringy enough to be annoying, missions can be exciting, and they've injected a lot of mystery into some of the subplots that unravels in cool ways. Let's see what else. If you like marrying video game characters because you're a broken man, I've got good news. You can wed a snake-worshipping Russian, a British person, a cowboy, or a quirky black dude. You can't marry the best companion, however, so I'm gonna need modders to get to work on that. And I think that's good enough for a brief overview, so let's move on to...
On and off the court, straight fundamentals. No funny business.
Alright, let's crack this open. I don't know if this started as a joke that eventually got picked up as a sincere thought, as often happens in the internet age, but that whole Starfield takes 12 hours to get good meme that was going around makes very little sense to me. I can pretty well promise you, if you're 11 hours into the game and you're bored to fucking tears, that last 60 minutes isn't going to make much of a difference. But anyway, let's talk about these divisive opening hours. There's a pretty widely circulated article from PC Gamer that encompasses a wide berth of player opinions on the topic, and the opening paragraphs addressing pacing are really not bad, so we'll start there. It opens with a simple enough statement that Starfield's intro is lacking in comparison to Fallout 3's. And you know I hate to go off on a tangent, but who told you guys that Fallout 3's intro was good? It is a severely bloated, nonsensically written circus of an hour that you will never get back. It's certainly interesting in theory to let the player grow up in a vault and do a small amount of very shallow role-playing, but this did not work. Specifically because it had to become an actual video game at some point, and while playing as a baby was already pretty whack, they fumbled the bag even harder the second the script called for actual conflict. But I'm going to delete the other 400 words out of this rant and move on, because it's 2023 and my name isn't Harris. There's a reason that New Vegas went the complete other direction, and most other good RPGs do as well, and I'll leave it there. I'm not saying the Starfield intro of entering a mine, grabbing a MacGuffin, immediately fighting pirates, and getting recruited into the Illuminati is peak realistic writing, but it gets you into the action fast in what I think is a more than serviceable way, especially compared to prior Bethesda efforts. With this bit about expressing the kind of character you want to play as in the intro specifically, I guess I just don't understand why people want that. Let me explain. So, dialogue-wise, you can choose to be a typical guy, an overly enthusiastic guy, or a flippant dildo, but it doesn't really affect anything. Then the game quickly introduces the two types of combat and gives you the first major mission, before dropping you at the first major population center. The moment you're here, all bets are off and you start doing things your way, if you have the inclination to. Almost immediately, I wandered into a bank, met a shady executive, cut a deal, and went out to hurt people for money. That was me expressing my character and playing the way that I wanted to. I just don't see why flavor text in an on-rails intro should be where we're looking for maximum character establishment. In my view, the faster I can begin making actual choices in the world, the better. I sort of reject the idea that Starfield slows to a crawl here. I disagree entirely, in fact. You're immediately given access to a variety of missions well suited to your level, faster than in most RPGs. And to back up to the realism concerns, if you don't like that you become a badass hero immediately rather than being made to toil for it, I genuinely get that. But this perspective that Starfield should be more slow and realistic than, say, Fallout or Skyrim, based solely on the setting, just strikes me as a bit unfair. Nothing about this game screamed realism to me, and while it's not fantasy like Elder Scrolls or quite as quirky as Fallout, nothing about those franchises exudes such a level of absurdity that going a little over the top should be allowed there but not here. But to each their own, I'm sure many disagree. With that out of the way, let's get to gameplay. And I have to admit to you guys, I gave up on Doom Eternal. I do not have a high shooter IQ or good reflexes, and as such, I don't have exceptionally high standards when it comes to the complexity of a game's shooting mechanics. If things function and don't feel floaty or bad on the level of like Far Cry 5, I'm usually happy. So feel free to take that into consideration when I tell you that I find Starfield's ground combat to be pretty fun. Not as engaging as a more focused shooter, but it gets the job done. AI enemies can break and behave stupidly, everyone has told you that already, but in general they take cover, move in sensible ways, and are fully capable of punishing you for getting more careless than your chosen difficulty allows. The guns feel pretty good, still right around the level of Fallout 4, so not remotely a step forward for the industry, but I do prefer the gunplay here. There is quite a lot of variety, especially as far as weapons that actually feel different to use. The loot system functions rather well, upgraded and legendary variants of weapons drop at a steady pace, and you can always strip the cool looking armor off the corpses you make. Doing so doesn't actually remove the clothing from the character models though, which was a letdown for me because disrespecting the dead is a pivotal component of my role-playing strategy, but I got over it. I do wish they had consolidated the ammo types a little more though, realism be damned, because there are so many fucking types and it feels a little needless, but I doubt that it will impact your experience all that much. The melee does not feel good, and I didn't really want to bother with it until I got a broken ass sword that was just too good to ignore, but it's certainly no worse than the bad melee combat of every other Bethesda game, so if you liked it there, you're still in for a treat. Now, the environments that you'll frequently find yourself fighting in are easily Bethesda's best and all around solid, generally speaking. Even the ones that get reused and dropped in the middle of fucking nowhere, like the research stations and factories, were clearly put together with some degree of love, even beyond the great aesthetic detail. There's many ways to move through them, hidden areas, often environmental tools and hazards to take advantage of, and even between the near carbon copies, different doors will be locked or unlocked, and different paths will be blocked over with ice or whatever the fuck from location to location. Then moving to the more significant main story and major side quest environments, all of those positive traits carry over on top of a grander scale, more specific environmental details, good verticality, everything you'd expect from a bigger, more important dungeon. While nothing is on the level of, say, a decent immersive sim, and people could and have argued that all of this should be expected after 10 years of expensive development, I'm all around pleased. When it comes to ship combat and general travel through space, I kind of just find myself in the same place as everyone else I've talked to about it, which is that it's not offensively shitty, maybe outside of scripted battles that you may very well be underprepared for, because who the fuck wants to waste points in that tree, but no one is about to throw it a parade either. I just get very little out of it. I can get a little annoyed with how controlling the ship feels in dogfights, but it's not typically difficult enough for that to become infuriating, and there is a mini dopamine hit to be had from blowing up a band of pirates every once in a while. Generally, I would label it as very meh. Some people will love it because there will always be weird people, but I think I find myself in the same place as the majority and don't have a ton to add there. Now, moving on to the outposts, the resource gathering, and the various kinds of crafting that are bolstered by them, things get a little fucking scuffed. Todd Howard recently gave an interview where he kind of acknowledged that these systems aren't the most intuitive and aren't explained to the player in the best way, stating that he was okay with letting the player base figure it out. And I'm not really sure what's to be gained there, like at all, but it coincides with the developer choice to make all of these things pretty non-essential. If you liked No Man's Sky and you want to build a ghetto-ass research station in the middle of nowhere and go mine mercury, there's a lot of that here for you, and I think the niche audience that appeals to must be fucking ecstatic. For the rest of us, that is completely optional. At no point are you required or even told how to make best use of those capabilities, and if you're driven to invest heavily in your crafting and upgrade abilities, because the variety of modifications you can make is genuinely kind of cool, and you're going to be needing those resources, there are specialty shops around the map that can provide almost anything you'll need. And I think allowing players to bypass that, even when it could be a major component of the gameplay loop, was pretty good thinking. Because I tried it all out for the sake of this video, and it is not what I want out of this game. Maybe a little mellow and relaxing for some, but if I just have to relax and perform a menial virtual task, I'll just go play fucking Slime Rancher or something, I don't know. I know if I had been forced to do this for any considerable stretch of time, I would have very few good things to say about it, so I like that it's left completely to the side for only the initiated players to take advantage of. Now on to the RPG mechanics and the smaller gameplay features that they bolster. This is a pretty shallow experience. Some of the abilities that are unlocked far down their respective trees are neat, and bonuses provided to combat efficiencies by maxing out specific skills are very noticeable, but at the end of the day, you do get to be a jack of all trades, and how you choose to build a character isn't really going to change that or lead to exciting variation between builds. Also, stealth is just really fucking bad and broken. I didn't fully invest in those skills, so maybe there's a threshold where it becomes totally awesome or even just functional at a fundamental level. I don't really know, so invest at your own risk. The abilities that impact gameplay the most by a landslide have to do with ship modifications and outpost building, which again are the things that people seem to care the least about. The new skill tree came with another overhaul to the speech system, and I think it's a fine little minigame, even though I liked both the straightforwardness of New Vegas' system and the pure schizophrenia of Oblivion's system more. They also combined both the hacking and lockpicking from the Fallouts into this digipick system, and while I'm actually kind of a fan of their simple old lockpicking, I like the digipicks a lot. You actually have to use a little spatial intelligence and, on more challenging locks, think several moves ahead. And I think all of that lands us squarely at the conclusion. Maybe a lot of what you get out of Starfield comes down to your expectations. And maybe that's a fat cope and I just like boring bad games. I'm not sure. I know I was in a pretty severe minority for strongly disliking Fallout 4 back in 2015, even though people coincidentally started to become a lot more critical about 3 years later, but I've always been willing to defend that stance. So if I'm again in the minority for thinking that Starfield, despite the aforementioned problems, is pretty fun and a better product than Bethesda typically gives us in almost every way, I'm okay with that too, and I'm happy to hear what you guys think, both on this topic and about what you might like from the channel in the future. So, make sure you flush all your meds, and I'll talk to you guys later.